Hi, I'm Zach. I'm your cult boyfriend. What this is, it's a. Let me redo it. Hold on. Keep filming. Hi, I'm Zach. I'm your cult boyfriend. This video is a collection of analysis. Fuck it. How do I say it? Hold on.
Analyses.
This is it. This is the last one. This will go at the very end of the video, where they can see how bad I do. Um, Hi, I'm Zach. I'm your cult boyfriend. It's great to see you. What this video is a collection of analysis videos that I've done in the past for Metropolitan, Barcelona, and The Last Days of Disco, directed by Whit Stillman, known as the doomed Bourgeois in Love trilogy or series of films. I think these are good videos. I think these are three of the best films on the planet. And it's been a while, so hopefully this will satisfy you until I come out with an actual analysis video. Thank you.
Metropolitan is a masterpiece. It's fucking beautiful and I love it. I finally watched it for the first time recently. And yeah, I fell in love with it. I've watched it quite a few times since then. It's an extremely watchable film. I loved it so much. The angst was touching, the social alienation felt sincere. I felt exposed by Chris Eigman's performance in it. Seriously, I related to Nick Smith a lot. Uh, it's a wonderfully written, wonderfully composed, wonderfully directed, and wonderfully acted film. Whit Stillman seems to, through his films, provide us with portraits of um, a certain subculture or a certain piece of like the American pop culture, of youth culture that is in its death throes. I'm basing this on having only seen two films at this point, but The Last Days of Disco is certainly about the final days of the disco movement and how the yuppie scum deserve their redemption too. And Metropolitan is similar in its themes in that while we're not talking about disco, we are talking about the the young preppy bourgeoisie, uh, well, posing as bourgeoisie. Some of these kids are of limited resources financially, uh, but it's about debutante balls, debutante society, and a strange amount of choreographed social interactions, and they make a point of saying that these kinds of contrived social interactions, these theatrical ones, they are some of the first introductions into society that the young girls involved here have experienced. And in the case of Audrey, I think Audrey can really embody the kind of integrity, the the purity, or maybe not even the purity. That might be a bit off base. It's the heart. She's the heart of the entire movement, and I think Whit Stillman looks at these groups like the disco movement or the debutantes of old Manhattan society, and he can see the value within privileged scenarios. He wants to lament and give dignity to groups of people that have gone unconsidered, have gone unseen in an artistic and philosophical way. And it's through characters like Nick Smith. There's a great deal of self awareness to these kids, even through all of their pontificating and all of their extremely practiced social gestures and mores and um, extremely practiced social and romantic movements. There's a truth to them. There's a truth to each and every one of them. Nick Smith speaks my truth of being incredibly self-aware, very obnoxious, but also I think like hyper intelligent, which makes him hyper confrontational because I think he feels extremely insecure, and that being invited to this level of society gives him a sense of order in a chaotic, barbaric modern world. And I think that's why I like Nick Smith so much. He's also incredibly funny, and I think he's incredibly touching. And I believe that Whit Stillman is a wonderful writer, considering that. this follows my favorite structure for any dramatic piece, especially if we're talking about coming of age stories, which Metropolitan certainly is one. I like the Mercutio archetypes. I like having a character in the piece that the piece insists on so much, um, that the piece is kind of motivated by. Nick Smith is the guiding, determined force of the first two acts of the film, right? Like he is there and he is moving everything forward in a philosophical way, in a political way, in a social way, in a visceral way that really connects with the audience, and in intellectual ways as well. And of course, he's removed from us before the climax, before the third act, and his departure signals in a more tragic tone to the film because once Nick has been forced to go back upstate to see his stepmother and father, um, we really do see the death rattle of this society and how it kind of disintegrates and it's falling apart. And you have these aimless people who still believe in some empty modality of virtue, but at least they believe in virtue. And at least they fall in love with girls who learned what love was through Jane Austen, and I think there is a deep, sensual, integrity to that kind of romantic and social fixation. But once Nick leaves, yeah, it takes a more tragic tone, and things are more disparate. Things are more removed from each other, and uh, the 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 debutante society has fallen apart. The Deb society is through. It's over. The last days of Debs. And of course, that is like, Mercutio in Romeo and Juliet when he's removed from us at the end of the second act. It ushers in the tragedy that will overwhelm the remainder of Shakespeare's play. And you can see Mercutio elements being used like in Disturbing Behavior, in the musical Rent, in Spring Awakening as well, and The Godfather with Sonny. Like it's all over the place, and I think it's probably the most powerful tool that you can utilize if you are telling a tragedy. And Metropolitan, I think, is telling a tragedy. It's a tragic comedy, just like The Last Days of Disco was, but I feel like Metropolitan is a lot more tragic in the sense that, at least in The Last Days of Disco, there was a certain amount of decadence. Kate Beckinsale and Chloe Sevigny and like Matt Kiesler and even Chris Eichman in that film, they all participated in the erotic tapestry of the disco movement. They all participated in some of the more sexual liberating characteristics that defined disco in the 70s. But this Deb society that we're seeing in Metropolitan, it is incredibly limited and restricted when it comes to uh, engaging in romantic conquest, engaging in romantic trysts. Like you have to make declarations, or there's a character called Von Slonaker that Nick completely despises, and I believe for good reasons, even though he exaggerates and tells lies about Von Slonaker. He uses composites of different women that Von Slonaker is said to have abused and driven to suicide. And I think in a larger way, Nick is saying that people like Von Slonaker are driving the Deb Society as a whole to kill itself. Um, in a morbid tribute to this new kind of more dangerous rock and roll long hair, but extremely rich and fake. The fake sensitivity of Von Slonaker will destroy uh, the feminine dignity of the Deb society, of this this upper crust kind of society of manners. And most of these um, young people involved with the society seem to be incredibly restricted and insecure sexually. It is, I think that's what makes it kind of tragic, but what also makes it so sweet, because at the end of the film, when Charlie and Tom rescue in their minds. They rescue, and they truly do. They rescue Audrey from von Sloniker's Northampton beach house or whatever. Um, it's a pretty decent moment. He's even holding like an antique gun as a way of intimidation, and the fact that it is antique, I think, speaks poetic volumes because the he is doing something that's archaic. He is the last defender of a dead ritual at this point, and he's trying to save the very heart and soul of it in Audrey, and he does. But when he has her on the beach, he is talking a bit more truthfully, but he's still pontificating. He's still insecure. He's still restricted in his limited idea of love, of art and literature, and of romantic timing. But there is something a bit more immediate to his words, even though they are still verbose and kind of insensitive. They're there, and he's trying, and I think he definitely loves Audrey at that point. Fascinatingly, Tom hasn't read any Jane Austen. He hasn't read like War and Peace. Hasn't read any Tolstoy. He doesn't read fiction, but he reads critical analysis of fiction, which is fucking hilarious. It is a funny film. I think it's a lovely film with incredible performances, and yeah, I related. I identified with Nick quite a bit. Um, I can be a self-destructive postmodern rat at times, and I saw a lot of myself in Nick's violent, obnoxious faux pas, the social ones and the sexual ones. Um, I saw a lot of myself in Nick, and I think that's really beautiful and really kind of the film to speak to me so deeply. And I liked how much Metropolitan resonated with me as a coming of age tale. It's entirely incredibly sophisticated. Coming of age is a deconstruction of youth, but in Whit Stillman's universe, which seems to be so all encompassing, it's an entire portrait of this movement, of this group of people that once existed and once thrived and once were just as odd and contagiously affectionate as any other group. It's not simply just a deconstruction of youth in Whitstone and science. It's a deconstruction of culture as it stands, as it stood, and how it always seems in an idealized form. It's a deconstruction of nearly everything for Whit Stillman because he's not just fixated and focused on the players involved. He's curious. He's at least affectionately curious about the concept of cultures, movements for young people, movements within youth being failures, or are they successful? What determines failure in the larger eyes of culture as a whole and culture as we know it. And while it refuses to make any direct statements there, well, it makes us go back to a, a micro level. And we can say, I believe in Charlie, Tom, and Audrey walking down the side of the road, can't catch a ride. No one's going to pick up these last vestiges of the Deb Society, of the UHB. No one's going to pick up the last of the urban bourgeoisie. Who could? But there's a discreet charm to them, isn't there? And while I don't think symbolically those remaining few ever got a ride to continue, I like to imagine them frozen in that existential inertia of stasis that Whit Stillman ends Metropolitan with, that freeze frame. And I like to imagine that they are doing their best to be authentic, that authenticity and dignity are constantly opposed forces in the modern world. And I have to admire those people who, even though they seem restricted and disingenuous, they're trying to be authentic while trying to be dignified because nothing causes you to lose your dignity more than being obnoxiously authentic. Sometimes it's not about the thing, it's about its representation. I think that's what Nick Smith and I and Whit Stillman understand the most. My name is Zach. I'm your cult boyfriend, and today we are going to talk about um, these this series of films here. The topic, the main focus of our discussion, this series of films by Whit Stillman. He's the first director of my 30s that I think has really spoken to me because I've seen all of these films for the first time in the last year. So, very good stuff. Very good stuff. I watched Barcelona today. Very cool exploration of doomed bourgeois in love. Stillman creates these insincere environments filled with insecure people, and he studies how the necessary subtext of romantic fantasy and politics deliberately undermines the text itself. And it's seen as a series or a trilogy of sorts with the Last Days of Disco and Metropolitan. And while Barcelona isn't as great as Metropolitan or the Last Days of Disco, there's still a lot going on in it. Um, and while it's not as I think as powerful or as insightful, um, it might be more cinematic, you know. Stillman doesn't necessarily like to do, like superficial or traditional, commonplace cinematic things in his films. They're extremely fascinating films, but on the surface, they might seem to be like fetishizing mundane scenarios and yuppie individuals. Well, because Stillman firmly believes that the yuppie deserves their eulogy too. And I completely agree. There is a tragedy of conformity, and it's of the heartbreaking variety because it is so insecure. Maybe not repressed, but entirely insecure. Like too self-aware to make any like grand statements or declarations, and whenever they do, they're normally punished for it because those sorts of things are faux pas in like the bourgeois sect of youth culture, which has always and will always exist. Barcelona is upsetting. There's violence in this film. There's a great deal of scenery, sometimes chaotic, sometimes mundane, sometimes serene, but often insincere. Or at least these are situations that take place in settings that are captured through these captivating but insecure types, which makes the setting feel insincere because the environment is fostering insecure diatribes and insecure expressions of young people, which makes the setting itself seem kind of insincere. The film is infused with a sort of paranoia, either through Chris Eigeman's his character is rightfully paranoid, considering that people lie and conspire against him and say that he's like the leader of the CIA or something completely absurd, and he's the target of a an attempted political assassination. And that's what I'm talking about. The most upsetting moment is also Stillman's most cinematic. I think to Stillman, true cinema is truly upsetting because once we get it, and I'm talking about editing, I'm talking about sound design, I'm talking about composition, I'm talking about poetic callbacks, and I'm talking about sensitivity through through motion pictures. It's when so how do I set this up properly? Chris Eigeman and Taylor Nichols, they star in the film as cousins. You might remember them from Metropolitan. Probably Chris Eigeman played Nick Smith in Metropolitan, one of my favorite characters ever, a Mercutio type, and I thought they were going to do the same thing in Barcelona. When I say Mercutio type, I mean someone who the film or the play, the work, the narrative insists so much on this character, who is obviously not the lead, but you kind of gravitate towards him, and it's through that character that the ethos of the entire project is being expressed. And normally they're taken from us at the end of Act Two, which can give way to basically the death of Mercutio introduces tragedy into Romeo and Juliet, and there are Mercutio archetypes and everything. And if you watched my everything that I love dearly, maybe not everything, but if you watched my Metropolitan video, I discuss how Nick Smith is as a Mercutio character when he's removed from us. 2 acts in, it takes a bit more tragic and disconnected and a sadder kind of tone uh, that the film itself like dissociates, and it's really interesting to watch. In Barcelona, I thought we were going to do the same thing, but he survives that bullet to the head that he took in the back of a taxi cab. So and it's this beautifully designed, really, because the way that he got into that situation, um, it's foolhardy insecurities, having to defend his idealistic concept of America, which is the concept of his own individuality. Honestly, that's why he kind of like latches onto it so much, and it's also like the only thing that makes him feel moral in any sort of sense because he is a member of the Navy. But he's staying with his cousin, Taylor Nichols, and he gets kicked out of there because um he thinks that Chris Eichman has stolen a substantial amount of money from him when it was really Mira Sorvino's character. So he heads over to Mira Sorvino's house and finds her sleeping with another man, a bunch of drugs all on the table, like she took the money. And he catches a cab. He doesn't say anything to her. He just catches a cab, and in the back of the cab, he's saying these affirmations to himself that he originally mocked because Taylor Nichols reads a lot of self-help books and stuff. Um, and that's where he first heard these kind of phony affirmations that he definitely thought at the time when he first heard it were insincere and fake and kind of weak. And he's doing it in the back of the cab, every day in every way. I am a better Lieutenant Gray, something like that. And he says it like twice. He looks out the window at this shooter on a gun, it's just shooter on a gun, a shooter with a gun on a bike pulls up to his window and shoots him, bang, and cut to black. It's fucking gorgeous. And Stillman is a lot more talented and capable cinematically than a lot of critics would really recognize him for being. He's most recognized, I think, for having these incredible conversations with his characters, a certain kind of dialogue. Infused with diatribes that are incredibly insightful, and he's like this postmodern deconstructionist of bourgeois youth culture. He normally fixates on a period that is in its death rattle because the Metropolitan dealt with the Deb Society near the end of its reign throughout youth culture. The last days of disco, it's evident in the title, right? It's the final days of a youth movement. In Barcelona, it's the end of the Cold War. He really likes to focus on these opportunities of truth that only the death rattle of a very specific kind of youth culture can provide. I'm not necessarily saying these opportunities of beauty. They're opportunities of truth, which is different than capturing beauty. It's less romantic, but it's a lot more engaging on an intellectual level. Barcelona, while there are a lot of interesting things going on, there are interesting dynamics. It's not as devoted to pontification, to philosophy. Like it doesn't have as much of a direct, of a verbal philosophical bent as the other two films, which is the only reason why I think it's a little less moving because there is a lot to get into here. It's just not necessarily the sorts of themes that I like to explore. Like I don't care about how a Bible can be juxtaposed with self affirmations of capitalism. Like I'm not. I'm not too into that. Like dancing around with a copy of The Economist and a copy of the Old Testament in your hand while you're listening to jazz music. I'm not too interested in that. Like it's poetic, as you can clearly identify from each symbolic component of what I just described to you. It's just not as interesting to me, I suppose. Mira Sorvino, though, was incredible in this film. She's a great actor, and dude, wow, wow, I have a serious crush now. I forgot about her, and seeing her here, I think that she has some of the best moments, and I think that she may be the character that Stillman's the least sympathetic towards in all three films, which isn't to say that he doesn't like her character, but she is, I mean, she's antagonistic, you know. But she's fucking so beautiful and so hot, and I loved every moment that she was on screen. She has that natural magnetism to her, and I really love that she shared most of her scenes with Chris Eigeman, who is the character who I always love following the most in Stillman's work, or at least one of the characters I enjoy following the most. And they had a really cool energy, and it's very difficult to place her motives because they seem foreign or alien, but that's the point of Barcelona. These Americans there, they can act like assholes and they can act completely self-obsessed, and it's almost always forgiven because they consider that the Spanish women consider that a cultural kink or like a cultural trait that they have to respect and they simply don't understand or something like that. But it gets more complicated because I mean, all Americans are fascists or something in the eyes of a lot of these characters here. When they see these outward problems that these characters expose and express, they're seen as these cultural traits, but at the same time, they can also be seen as toxic cultural traits too. But Mira Sorvino's Marta, and Montserrat in a large way, actually. Like you don't know what these women are thinking, and but a part of these characters um, simply assumes that the condition of American exceptionalism or of like the anxious American human condition is universal when it's actually not. So, like, there's a lot of projection onto these women when they don't seem to provide these characters or the film or the audience with the sort of reactions that you need dramatically in order to have a coherent sort of narrative. And that's really interesting. I think the most fascinating parts of this film are about the subtext interfering with the text, and they do have a conversation about this, like where Fred knows what subtext is, but he doesn't know what you call the layer above it, which is clearly called the text, because no one's ever interested in the text. They're interested in the subtext. And the text of Barcelona is political. The text of Barcelona is about actual like love and political turmoil. And the subtext of Barcelona is about, you know, American exceptionalism, about rejection, about inadequacies, both political and sexual, about existential inertia and like life-threatening postmodern the life-threatening effects that postmodernism can have on young people arriving at a certain point in their lives. That's the subtext. And while these characters seem really invested and devoted in the subtext and exploring the subtext of each other, it's the text that seems to be most frustrated by that. And the text is what has the largest effect on the characters involved. There are, I mean, this is political violence. Fred gets shot in the face for political violence, for the text that we try to ignore. There are bombings going off at USO houses. There are acts of war going on, of political violence, political unrest and unease. And Barcelona is so fascinated with the juxtaposition between text and subtext, especially when text dominates. I mean, inherently, intrinsically, but by definition, text dominates circumstance. Yet it's the subtext that we're so egotistically devoted to. Fred gets shot in the face, and Pete, Taylor Nichols, even says aloud, like, I can only process colossal events that happen in life in an egoist lens. Like I thought of how this affected me. So it's like even dealing with text, you have to deal with the subtext. You're not even truly dealing with the text. He's not even dealing with when he wakes up, like the trauma from awakening from a coma after being the target of political violence. He even like it's funny, like, he forgives the journalist who wrote all these lies about him because he's like, "Well, you're gonna be my in with this girl I'm really interested in now." So the subtext dominates the text once again. But what happens is, like, this postmodern conversation between text and subtext is the most intrusive thing possible, and it's also the most egotistical thing possible because the text is what dominates our lives, even if we would rather wax poetic about our insecurities and about our wants and desires, goals, ambitions, and the outcomes of those things. That's subtext. And the text doesn't necessarily have a moral framework. Subtext does, and subtext is decidedly nihilistic a lot of the time. So there's a lot going on in Barcelona, and I think it really is a fascinating film. It's the weakest of the series of Whit Stillman doomed bourgeois and love films, but it's so powerful, and I think it truly is a good film, a really, really good film. And I hope you enjoyed my video about it. I hope you have a really pleasant day. Thank you for watching me. All right, I'm gonna try not to sound too hysterical in this video because I just finished watching The Last Days of Disco. Oh God, there it is. There, well, whatever. I'll just put up a picture. I just got finished watching it, and I was like emotional, man. I was crying, not because it was sad or tragic. Maybe because it was not neither of those things. I was so like life affirming in a way that I haven't been hit or touched by a motion picture like that in such a very long time. I love this film. I can honestly say it's one of the 10 best films of the 90s, and you have to know how much I absolutely cherish that decade. So that's not a statement I make lightly nor hyperbolically. It's simply genius. I haven't seen anything quite like it. It's one of the best examples, pieces of postmodern art, postmodern American art that I have ever seen in my entire life. Whoa, I'm still shaking from like the energy of the film, the philosophical energy, the poetic energy, the romantic energy, the unsentimental energy. And yet, what I'm going to be talking about today is a character who tries to apply a philosophy and tries to uh, really complicate disco with sentimentality. I think for the most virtuous of possible reasons. I'm going to be talking about the character Josh today. Hello, Whit Stillman. Meet your cult boyfriend. I think you and I are going to get along famously. It's an incredible film from 1998, starring Kate Beckinsale and Chloe Sevigny, as well as an incredible ensemble surrounding them. I'm going to be talking about a character played by Matt Kiesler today. The character's name was Josh. I can spend an hour probably on each of the components of the ensemble because each character was just so hyper involved with me. Like I was vibing emotionally and, intellectually, physically, even with every single character in here. Uh, and each one of them means the world to me, but the one that struck me as the most potent and the most powerful and the most philosophically resonant to me personally was Josh. But I would be a fool. You would have to lock my clown ass up if book this clown. You'd have to lock me in jail and throw away the key if I didn't mention that Kate Beckinsale and Chloe Sevigny are absolutely breathtaking and incredible. Chloe Sevigny, this is one of my favorite performances from her. It's a wild performance with a million layers, and I love the character so much. Alice is enormously provocative intellectually and physically. She is Just amazing. I'm clearly speechless by her performance. Kate Beckinsale. I have always had a thing for Kate Beckinsale, so I'll try my best to resist the urge to just go gross man on you. Yeah, sure, she was beautiful, of course. Wow. Ugh. Oh my God. But this character is fascinating. This is also one of her best performances, too. There's a cold and harsh a socially brutal exterior to her character, to Charlotte, and yet there is this interiority that is beyond hypersensitive. It is already shattered, I feel like. There's a lot I can go into with both of the two principal leads here. They were both incredible, but today I'm going to be focusing on a few things that Josh has to say because an analysis of the last days of disco would be so long, just so incredibly long that I I think I'll be back to dive into some more of the themes, but I think that through Josh I can at least get my gut responses to this postmodern masterpiece. So Josh, when we first meet the character, he's saying like, I'm still a loyal adherent to the disco movement. And he's talking to Robert Sean Leonard, who is a very underrated actor overall and gives a very nice performance in this film, even though his character is remarkably unlikable. There's a fascinating amount of intensity to all of Robert Sean Leonard's performances, and he's kind of gone unsung in a large way. But that's who he's talking to. And he brings up an interesting idea of, before disco, we didn't have anywhere to go. The youth didn't have anywhere to go. But now there are these venues, these social venues, these nightclubs, and now they're incredibly hard to get into. The social life that is dreamt of by the youth, by people in their 20s and late teens, is now becoming limited and exclusive. Disco is exclusive, and that's one of the faults that Josh sees within the disco movement, as he calls it. And sure, it could be a movement as well because these nightclubs are filled with ad agency executives and attorneys and assistant book editors. These are conformists, right? These are conformists who wouldn't be able to exercise any amount of nonconformity had disco not made itself available. Now, disco can be seen by, punk and metal and hippie and rock communities as conformist, but I think that it's Kate Beckinsale's character in this that calls like the Woodstock and the hippie movement incredibly self-involved and narcissistic, and I would have to agree completely. Um, at a disco, an assistant editor and an ad agency exec can exercise and experiment with nonconformity, can experiment with romantic entanglement, can experiment with some of the darker places that youth can take you. And also some of the more unexpected and romantic ones as well. And you get these hypercharged conversations from disco clubs as well. You can totally believe that these characters, all with college degrees, are sitting around deconstructing pop culture, deconstructing pop sensibilities through pop sensitivities. You can buy that. You wouldn't be able to buy that with any other youth movement, really. But the most important thing that Josh says is around the middle of the film. They're actually deconstructing Lady and the Tramp, and Josh is challenged for his cynical sort of reading of the film. And he's told that the tramp changes, right? That the tramp changes. He becomes a family man. He becomes loyal. He becomes lovable, right? And Josh says, I don't believe that people can change like that. We can change our context, but we can't change ourselves. Let me repeat that for the people in the back. We can change our context, but we can't change ourselves. And that is at the heart of this postmodern masterpiece, right? The disco movement is seen as dead. I mean, and even till this day, no one truly looks back nostalgically at it without a strong sense of irony. It's not something that has been reclaimed, at least not without irony or satire or some self-aware involvement. It hasn't purely re-emerged, so to speak. Yet youth movements, youth cultures, subcultures, right? They all feature the same kinds of people, the same kinds of individuals. It's just a different sort of context. But each movement does have its unique characteristics, and there were characteristics completely unique and singular to the disco movement. This film ends with disco being pronounced as dead by the old doorman of the nightclub that got raided by FBI agents. This film does give like a few superficial reasons for why disco would die, the herpes epidemic, the illegality of the nightclubs that were a staple of disco culture, and also the fact that they're just getting older and they lived through an entire movement. And that's actually the scene where Josh tries to imbibe the death of disco with sentimentality. And he's saying, like, this meant something. And disco means something singular. It means something unique. And the film ends with him and Alice on a subway train, and they do a little bit of a dance at each other. The context has changed, but the people haven't. Disco is eternal, just like whatever happened before disco is eternal. Youth culture is eternal. Romance is eternal. Unsentimentality and sentimentality alike are eternal. And perhaps sentimentality can only be applied to a situation once it is dead, once it's gone. Maybe that's the only way that you can authentically apply sentimentality to a movement when it's no longer available to interact with. So the sentimentality that Josh applies to disco is a truthful mode and form of mourning. This film is just so fucking incredible to me, dude. And like it's shot so well, it's composed beautifully, and it's saying something about the eternal scope of disco, of the unique signifiers of the movement, and how context can change. But youth culture is still mostly recognizable. It's the tropes, it's the trappings, it's the atmospherics, and the aesthetics that have changed, but not the beat, not the rhythm, not the melodic nature of coming of age, growing up and giving in, and sometimes transcending that dichotomy. The Last Days of Disco is such a remarkable film that I'm having difficulty expressing just how much it truly affected me. I'm in love with this picture. One of the 10 best films of the 90s, one of my brand new favorite films that I've ever seen. It has deeply moved me. And this has just been a video talking about two conversations that happened in this film. I couldn't even do a full analysis. I would lose myself in poetics, but it would also take forever to do because there's so much here. There's so much here. The Last Days of Disco is beautiful, and I do think I provided some value through the insight I was able to demonstrate in this video. Please watch it if you haven't. I haven't really spoiled much. It's not that kind of film. Go watch it if you haven't yet, and, the doorman will let you in. Tell him your cult boyfriend sent you, and they'll let you inside. Thank you for watching. I've been your cult boyfriend talking about The Last Days of Disco.